All right, today we're going to begin our discussion of human mating. It's going to be a rather lengthy lecture, so I warn you about that. Three main topics that we're going to be discussing. First is the distinction between sexual and asexual reproduction. And we're going to discuss why sexual reproduction evolved. Then we're going to spend some time talking about a very important theory called the parental investment theory. And this theory is important because it provides the basic framework for everything that we know about human mating, right? It explains some very basic patterns that we see, for example, differences between men and women. And then we're going to spend most of the time in this lecture talking about long-term mating from the human female perspective. So what criteria is it that they look for when they're looking for a high-quality long-term mate? But let's start with discussing sexual reproduction. The first thing to point out is that not all animals reproduce sexually, right? The video that I had you watch gives several examples of this. It talks about the desert grassland whiptail lizard that reproduces asexually, right? So the infants are, or the offspring are essentially clones of the mother. Right, so sexual reproduction is when two individuals each provide part of the genetic material for the creation of a new organism, and the result is that the new individual is not genetically identical to either the male or the female. This is very different from asexual reproduction, where the individual produces a genetically identical copy of itself, right? So without any fertilization from another individual. Another name for this is parthenogenesis. So so initially all reproduction was asexual, and there are several important advantages that come from asexual reproduction. First of all, creatures that reproduce asexually avoid the problem of searching for and selecting a mate. When you think about how much effort humans put into selecting mates, you can understand why it would be desirable to avoid such a cost. One of the problems with requiring the cooperation of another individual to reproduce is that the creature could actually go, without a mate and therefore be shut out of reproduction. Right? So asexually reproducing species avoid that problem. Another advantage to asexual reproduction is that all of the organism's genes are passed on to its offspring instead of only half of them. Right? So both of these things are huge benefits. Right? So the benefits of asexual reproduction are exactly the costs of sexual reproduction. Right, so sexual reproduction is expensive, and you can interpret that any way you want, but basically it requires adaptations for attracting a mate. So several adaptations for sexual selection can hamper survival. So the peacock's tail is a beautiful example of that. Right? Peacocks have a very extravagant tail to attract peahens. Unfortunately, it also makes it more likely that they'll be caught by predators, right? And these sexually selected traits like peacock's tail and other such extravagances require a lot of energy from the organism. And there's also competition, right? There's competition for mates among sexually reproducing species, right? Some individuals tend to dominate mating while others get shot out, right? So competition often leads to death, or at the very, not as lethal, they can get shot out of reproduction. So just to give you some numbers and an example, there's a type of sparrowhawk, a bird in Scotland, and the data shows that about 1/5 of the young, right? So 20% of them produce 90% of the next generation, which means that the remainder, right, the 80%, go without reproduction or almost without any reproduction. Right? So some individuals dominate the mating pool. So that's a huge cost of sexual reproduction. Another cost is that each offspring only has half of its parents' genes. Right? Parents pass on 50% of their genes to create the next generation. So that begs the question, why did sexual reproduction evolve? There have to be some really huge benefits that make up for these extraordinary costs that species have to pay in order to reproduce sexually. And most biologists argue that the benefits to sexual reproduction, the reason why it evolved, is because it produces genetically diverse offspring. Right? Offspring that are very different from each other and also can be very different from their parents. So there's different ways of cashing out what this benefit is of sexual reproduction, this genetic diversity. One is called the niche theory, which says that by producing genetically diverse offspring, it increases the range of niches that can be exploited by offspring. Right? So if each offspring is a little different from the other, they're going to exploit slightly different resources, they're going to occupy slightly different environments, and then that makes it likelier that they'll be able to survive and go on to reproduce. Another theory as to the benefits of genetic diversity have to do with what's called the parasite theory. Basically, by producing genetically diverse offspring, it makes it harder for parasites to spread from host to host. And this is the way that David Buss summarizes it. He says, sexual reproduction provides a radically different host environment for parasites compared with the original host. Right? So if a parasite can invade the parent, it doesn't mean that necessarily it'll be able to invade the offspring. And again, the video that I had you watch and answer some questions on discuss these benefits. Right? It talked about the top minnows in Mexico. They showed that some species reproduce sexually, others asexually, and the asexual reproducers ended up carrying a heavier parasite load than the sexually reproducing ones. And I thought it was a very elegant set of studies. All right, so there's clearly benefits to sexual reproduction. Right? Now this doesn't explain how it evolved. That still requires a lot of investigation. But I want to switch now to a topic of some psychology, right? Mating psychology. And the main point that's going to emerge is that our mating psychology is designed to get us the best mates that we can get. Right? When we find someone attractive and desirable, the cues that we pay attention to are ones that increase our reproductive potential, right? What we've called our inclusive fitness. They increase the chances that we'll be able to pass genes on to the next generation. Right? So our mating psychology requires paying attention to numerous cues. It requires weighing multiple factors together to come up with an overall assessment of someone, whether someone is a good mate or whether we should avoid mating with them. Now, one important cue that we need to take into account is our own desirability as a mate, right? And this is called assortative mating, right? We'll talk about what assortative mating is and why it's important, right? But we need to know how desirable we are in order for our mating to proceed adaptively. So assortative mating is the idea that people tend to pursue mates who are of similar mate value to themselves, right? Especially in the context of long-term mating. Right? So the idea then is that we don't, in general, and we certainly shouldn't, pursue people much lower than us in mate value and much higher than us in mate value. Right? Both of these things have consequences. Why is that? Because if you carry a torch for someone who is of much higher mate value than you, chances are you'll strike out, right? Chances are they won't want to be with you, and you could well end up alone, right? What about pursuing someone of lower mate value than yourself? Well, that'll hurt you either in terms of resources, right, or genetically, right, since some of their traits are going to be passed on to your offspring. All right, so as I said, there's an important theory that underlies human mating psychology and the mating psychology of all animals. And before we get to this theory, I want to take some time to point out the difference in the investment that's made by males and females among the human species. Right? Because that explains things like why females are choosier than males among humans. Right, so look at the difference in investment made by the two species. Sorry, by the two sexes. Right? Human females produce fewer gametes. Right? They produce fewer sex cells over their lifetime than human males do. Right? And because they produce fewer gametes, each gamete is much more valuable. Right? Females only produce approximately 400 eggs, while males produce millions of sperm. Right? You can replenish them at a rate of about 12 million an hour. Right? So compare that to each egg. So each egg is much more valuable than each sperm. Right? So females in reproduction, they invest this rare resource of the egg, and that's not where their investment ends. Right? Humans also, gestation is done internally. Right? Fertilization and gestation is done internally. Women have to do that, and they also end up, carrying out most of the child care after birth. Right. So females, human females, pay a huge cost in order to reproduce. Right. Males, human males, I should state, can invest very little in reproduction. Right? They can invest a lot, but they can also invest very little. Right? So the minimal investment in reproduction is much greater for females than it is for males. And this, as a result, women can pay a huge cost as a result of choosing a poor mate. Right? They can end up paying a huge cost. So this leads to the parental investment theory, which really has two parts. It's by Robert Trivers. The first part says that the sex that invests more in offspring, which is typically the female, but not always, will be more selective about mating. Right? They'll be choosier. They'll be more coy and less willing to just engage in mating at the drop of a hat. The flip side of that is that the sex that invests the least in reproduction will evolve to be more competitive, right, for sexual access to the high investing sex. Right? So they're going to be more competitive, they're going to be more opportunistic about their mating since they can invest very little, and when they can, they do. And we're going to see some of the implications of this for human males and females. All right, so we expect human females in general to be choosier than males. And it also depends on whether we're talking about short-term mating or long-term mating. Right? For short-term mating, like a casual fling, one-night stand, things of that sort, there you should see much bigger differences in choosiness, where males should be much more prone to this kind of behavior than females. But in the context of long-term mating, because both males and females have a lot to lose, right, because they can both make a lot of investment, there you expect to find the differences between men and women to be at least somewhat attenuated. Right? You expect both to be choosy. So we're going to be talking about long-term mating right now, and we're going to be talking about female long-term mating. And what we would expect, given the parental investment theory, is that females should be designed to prefer males with a high mate value. So the question is, well, what characteristics tell a woman that a man has a high mate value? So David Buss points out that there's three general things that women look for in men. Right? The very general things. Right? So the first is the willingness and ability of a man to provide resources for a woman and her children. Right? He has to be a good provider. Second is the willingness and ability to provide physical protection for a woman and her children. And third is the willingness and ability of a man to engage in direct parenting activities, right? Things like teaching, nurturing, providing social support, providing social opportunities for their children, right? Very general criteria. So the question then is, well, what specific cues can a woman use to help identify a guy that has these three general characteristics? Remember that young women often have to do this with very little information, right, about the man. So, for example, a lot of times it's done during the college years, where the men tend to be very similar to each other with similar financial resources and things like that. So a woman has to look for cues that help her to select one out of all these men. Right, so the cues that we're going to be talking about are good financial prospects, high social status, age, ambition and industriousness, dependability, emotional stability, athletic prowess, love, health, and signs that he wants and likes children. So let's start with financial prospects. Good financial prospects, right? David Buss found that good financial prospects is very important in women's mating preferences, and it's more important to women than it is to men. Right? So, research has been going on this topic since the 1930s in the United States. So in one study, college men and women had to rate 18 characteristics for their relative desirability in a marriage partner. Right? And they had to use a scale ranging from 0, but this is irrelevant, all the way up to +3, which would be that it's indispensable. Okay. And good financial prospects, one of the characteristics that they rated, women rated it at 1.8, while men rated good financial prospects at 0.9. Right? So half of that of women. So women clearly view this as more important. And this isn't something that only held in the 1930s. It's been replicated in the 50s, 60s, 80s, 90s, and thereafter. Right? So in a study reported by Buss in 1985, women rated it 1.9, while men rated it 1.02. Right? So not much of a change. What's interesting about this is that important social movements like the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, it made no impact to the results, right? There's still almost a twofold difference between the sexes. Women value financial prospects more than men. And I want to talk about another way of looking at this issue, and that's using Kenrick's minimum percentile procedure. Right, so it's a way of assessing how important a characteristic is for mate selection. So people are asked a question, they're presented with a question frame. What's the minimum percentile that you would find acceptable in a marriage partner for the trait? And then you can fill in the blank with any characteristic like social status, financial prospects. So remember what a percentile is, right? A percentile is the score at or below which the population is. So if a man is on the 80th percentile for earning capacity, that means he earns more than roughly more than 80% of the population. So American college women, right? The minimum percentile for earning capacity in a man was the 70th percentile, right, for a marriage partner. Right, so a man would roughly have to earn more than 70% of men in order to be viewed as a desirable mating partner. For men, right, the minimum percentile of earning capacity is the 40th percentile. Right, so they rate it much lower. Right, so this is a way of assessing how low are people willing to go and still find the person acceptable as a partner. Right, and we see that men are willing to go much lower than women are as far as earning capacity is concerned. Now, Kenrick has found that the importance of financial prospects depends on the seriousness of the relationship. Right, so here we have on one axis the minimum percentile, right, for earning capacity. The black dots are for men's ratings and the white dots for female ratings. And then we have different relationships, right? Dating, sexual relations, steady dating, and marriage. We can see as the relationship gets more serious, both men and women place greater importance on financial prospects. But consistently, women rate it as being a higher minimum percentile than men. Now, it's important, if you're going to talk about an evolved preference for men with access to resources, it's important to show that this isn't just an American trend. Right? Buss has done international study on mating preferences. It's a long-term study carried out from 1984 to 1989. He studied 37 different cultures on 6 continents and 5 islands. The sample size was huge. It was over 10,000 people. And this is a study that we're going to be referring to again and again as we talk about human mating. So I want to spend some time talking about it, right? So the sample carried out 37 different cultures, right, included men and women, and they were drawn from very different types of societies. Right, so the societies varied in mating system, like whether they were polygynous or monogamous. They varied in political structures, so they looked at socialist, capitalist, and communist countries. There was also racial and religious diversity in the samples. And in this world map, you can see the dots indicate places where they collected data. So pretty widespread. The one place they didn't seem to get to was Antarctica. So the respondents were asked to rate 18 characteristics on a scale from 0 to 3, 0 being irrelevant or unimportant, 3 being indispensable. And the characteristics included financial prospects, physical attractiveness, ambition and industriousness, chastity, right, virginity, and others. And as far as financial prospects are concerned, women across all continents, all political systems, all racial groups, and all systems of mating placed more emphasis, more value on good financial prospects than did men. Right? And the difference is about 100% difference. Right, so here's data from 5 countries: Japan, Zambia, Yugoslavia, Australia, and the US. The black bars are the women's ratings, the gray bars, the male ratings, and as you can see, consistently men rate this lower than women, although the difference is magnified in some places, but the trend is there universally. All right, this is just an example of 5 of the 37 countries that they looked at. Now, before we claim that this is an evolved preference for men with access to resources, we have to consider other possibilities. Right? One possibility is that women are typically excluded from access to power and resources in many places. So maybe they don't have an evolved preference for men with access to resources, but rather they have to value this just given the reality of the situation that they find themselves in, right? So to get the resources that they need, maybe they have to prefer men with access to resources. So it's not an evolved trend. If you change that condition, then maybe women wouldn't value financial resources more than men. Right, so this is called the structural powerlessness hypothesis. Right, so women value resources in men because they can't get them for themselves, while men place less emphasis on it because they already have the resources. But this hypothesis leads to the following predictions. First is that women who have access to power and resources should place less importance on financial prospects than women who do not. The flip side of that is that men who lack financial prospects should value economic resources in a mate more than financially successful men. So Buss looked at this. He looked at a subset of the data, and he found that highly successful women placed even more emphasis on good financial prospects than women who were less successful. Right? So that goes against the prediction of the structural powerlessness hypothesis. Women who do well want a man who's even more successful. And what about men? Right? Men who have low financial prospects don't value economic resources in a mate more than men who are financially successful. Okay, so the predictions from the structural powerlessness hypothesis are not supported. So Buss concludes that the preference might reflect innate patterns established by evolution, leading women to prefer men with access to resources. But for this to be an evolved preference, the right conditions had to be at work in the evolutionary environment, right? And Buss argues that they were in place. Right? First of all, in the evolutionary environment, there had to be resources to accumulate, right? There had to be stuff to accumulate. Otherwise, there would be no preference for males with access to resources. And there are such resources in the evolutionary environment, right? Access to territory, shelter, tools, hunting, right? Physical protection, right? Not all men. So the second point is that men had to differ in their holdings and their willingness to invest these resources. Right? So some men had to have more resources than others, and they had to be more or less willing to invest those resources. And we know that that's the case, right? Among traditional societies, some men are better hunters, better tool makers, better providers. So that would lead to a preference for a selective preference for the men who were the better hunters and providers. And finally, females should have to be more likely to get those resources if they have a long-term mate than if they only had short-term mates. And that's true, right? Women are more likely to get resources from a long-term mate, or if in a long-term mating relationship, than if they are only engaging in short-term mating. All right, so the second characteristic that women look for in a mate is social status. So women prefer to mate with high status men, and social status reflects where one stands among one's peers and competitors, right? It has to do with the level of esteem that's accorded to a person by other people, right? Whether they look up to them, whether they have social influence. And social status is important because it goes along with resources, right? High social status tends to be correlated with the control of resources. So Bruce Ellis has discussed some of the advantages that women might get from mating with high status males. Right? Well, first of all, it can elevate her own social status. Right? And we see this in many cases where women marry up socially and then acquire high social status as a result. Right? But due to the correlation between social status and resources, right, it can also increase her access to social and economic resources. Right, so they have a lot to gain from mating with high social status males. And Buss found in his international study that women in the majority, right, in the vast majority, value social status in a mate more than men did. But it isn't a universal. Right? It isn't universal. There's some places where there is no significant difference between the sexes, but wherever there's a difference, right, it's in the direction of women valuing it more than men. Right? There are no cultures that were studied by Buss where males valued social status more than females. Okay, so here's an example from 5 of the countries, right? Brazil, West Germany, Estonia, Taiwan, and the US. And we can see that in Brazil, West Germany, Taiwan, and the US, women preferred social or viewed social status as more important than men. Right? In Estonia, there was no difference. Now, the third factor that women look for is older men, slightly older men. So women prefer to engage in long-term mating relationships with men who are slightly older than they are. And around the world, the preference is about 3.5 years older. And in fact, women do tend to marry men who are about 3 years older than they are. So we're going to look at this graph again when we talk about the men here. It shows, this is based on a study by Buss that looked at ideal age differences between self and partner. Right, so what's the ideal age difference between you and a spouse? Positive numbers indicate that the spouse would be older, negative numbers that they would be younger. Right, and we can see the data here for men and for women. For men, the preference is for someone younger, and for women, the preference is for someone older. So why would that be the case? Right? Why would women prefer older men? The reason is because important other factors correlate with age. Right? Social status, prestige, access to resources, these things increase with age. Right? So Buss did the math. Right? He showed that 30-year-olds make an average of $14,000 more than 20-year-olds. 40-year-olds make an average of $7,000 more than 30-year-olds, and so on. Right? So you get more resources by being with an older man. But obviously there's a limit here, right? Women in general, right, unless the guy is super, super rich, right, they don't prefer to go for much older. And this is because although these men may have more resources, they're also at a greater risk for death and disease. They're also likelier to have other offspring from other women at that age. Right? So they're less likely to be around to contribute to the long-term care of and protection of the children. And also there's important differences in compatibility, right? Different generational differences, things that you can relate to that your partner might not be able to, so you have less in common. Right? The fourth characteristic is ambition and industriousness. Right? Sheer hard work, one of the best predictors of future success and in attaining promotions and raises in income. Right? In fact, Betsy Dessig has done some research on this. What factors make it likelier that a woman will want to discontinue a long-term relationship? She found that risk factors include if a man loses his job, or if he lacks career goals or gives the appearance of being lazy. Right, so young women, college-age women, may not be able to see huge differences in men as far as their resources go, but they can assess whether the man has ambition and industriousness, even as a college student. right? By how hard they work, whether they have goals. And across the 37 cultures, women rate ambition and industriousness as being between important and indispensable, right? So they rate it very high in importance, while men tend to rate it lower. Moving on to dependability, emotional stability, and maturity, right? Can you rely on the person? Do they fly off the handle, right? Are they emotionally stable and mature? These are important for both sexes, right? Nobody wants to be with an undependable person or who's someone who's unstable. But why is it important for women? Well, for women, dependability, emotional stability are related to the ability to consistently extract resources, right? If a man is undependable or unstable emotionally, he's less likely to be able to consistently provide resources. And emotional stability is also related to the likelihood of physical and emotional abuse, right? Things that obviously women want to avoid. Sixth, we have athletic prowess, right? Men prefer to marry men who are tall, strong, and athletic. This makes sense, right? In the evolutionary environment, these men would have been better hunters, right? They would have been able to extract resources more. But in modern society, these factors are also important, even though men don't literally go out and hunt. Right? But there is a connection between a man's height and his ability to obtain resources. Right? So Bruce Ellis has done some research on this, and he's come up with the cost of height. Right? Economically speaking, taller men are more likely to be hired in a job. They tend to receive higher starting salaries. They're more likely to be promoted than shorter men as well. So one of my favorite statistics is that between 1904 and 1980, the taller candidates in the US elections won 80% of the time. Right? So even with something as important as the US election, right, the taller candidate tends to win. Why is that? Because there's something about height that people interpret as dominance, right? Dominance being able to manipulate social situations to work in your favor, to get other people to do what you want. Right? So tall is dominance in people's minds. And from a mating perspective, taller men are also more sought after in personal ads. Right? So women have a preference for taller men. Now, in terms of things that women look for in a long-term mate, at the top of the list, the most important factor around the world is love. Right? So even if the resources are there, in most cases it's not enough if love is not present, right? Or shows the promise of developing. Right? So women and men prefer to mate with someone who displays feelings of love towards them. So what is love? Was a question I've asked myself many times, right? But at the heart of love is a commitment. And it's a commitment that has several dimensions to it, right? First of all, it implies fidelity, right? The exclusive commitment of sexual access to one person. Right? Another important commitment is economic resources, right? The channeling of economic resources. You take care of the other person. You give them your resources, right? It indicates that they're serious about the commitment, that they're serious about the long term. If they're not willing to share their resources, then there's probably something wrong. And also a commitment to emotional support, right? Do they put in the time, energy, and effort, right, into their partner's needs at the expense of their own needs, right? So do they listen to you? Do they listen to your problems? Do they try to help you out? So all of these things are a part of love. And as I said, this is the most important thing around the world. Next we have health, right? Men and women prefer to mate with someone who's healthy. And the reason for that is quite simple, right? If you mate with someone who's healthy, then your offspring are likelier to be healthier as well. They're likelier to have a better immune system. And also for women evaluating men, because if a man is healthy, he's also likelier to be able to stick around and help care for the children and provide resources and emotional support. And finally, we have the willingness and ability to engage in direct parenting. Right? So women want a guy who shows interest in having children, first of all, but also in taking the time to raise them. Right? Not just a sperm donor, but someone who's actually willing to spend time raising the kids. And there's lots of advantages that come from having a man that invests in the children, right? In addition to providing resources, right? Fathers also teach children a lot of things. In foraging societies, for example, fathers show their children how to hunt, right? And these are things that require a lot of time and a lot of investment in energy. Okay? So these are the characteristics in general that women look for in men when they're assessing a long-term mate. As I said, love is the most important characteristic. And in the next lecture, we'll look at long-term mating from the perspective of men.